Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on community planning, affordable housing, and homelessness. As this meeting is both in person and virtual, and we are all not gathered in the same space, I recognize that this land acknowledgement may not be for the territory that you're currently on. If this is the case, please acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. For those of us here in Toronto, I would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. My name is Leslie Wee, and I'm a professor at George Brown College. I'm sure we're all looking forward to today's session as we wrestle with what is a very topical issue. And with this in mind, I just want you to know that immediately after today's session, right here in this space, as you see behind you, city staff from the Housing Secretariat would like to solicit your input, your thoughts, your challenges, your wish lists when it comes to housing as part of the city's data collection for its academic housing strategy. I'll ask the speakers, whom we'll hear from shortly, to share more about this event with you in due course. Allow me now to put today's session into context. The CivicLabTO curriculum is presented by Strategic Partnerships and the City Manager's Office within the City of Toronto in collaboration with the 8 higher education institutions represented here today. The City and these institutions are forging a path of partnership and innovation between them. This work includes the development of a new model for the City and academia to collaborate on multi-partner and multidisciplinary research to inform policy and programs. We're thrilled to be hosting this year's CivicLabTO curriculum in the Council Chamber and have you, as students, experience this very unique learning space. Thank you to all our partners who made this possible. Before I pass this time to our speakers, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the dedicated CivicLabTO website in the near future. As such, you're asked not to share any personal information during the meeting. If you have joined us here in person at Council Chamber, please avoid joining the virtual WebEx seminar. The washrooms are located in the hallways by the elevators. And as always, there will be time for questions and answers towards the end of the session. If you're joining the session virtually and would like to submit a question, please enter it into the Q&A feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you're here in person and seated in council members' chairs, you may speak into the built-in microphones. To use the mics, simply press the speaking button to activate the mic, and once more after your question is asked to mute it. For those of us who are seated elsewhere in the chamber, we have a wireless microphone that can be brought to you. Please raise your hand and a member of the team will bring the mic to you. Lastly, everyone who is joining us virtually will be muted during the event. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers to you for this morning, and we'll hear from them in the following order. Firstly, from Deanna Chorley, Manager, Strategic Initiatives, Policy and Analysis, City Planning, followed by Sinead Canavan, Project Director, Issues Management, Toronto Shelter Support and Services, and lastly, Mercedes Mandani, Acting Director, Housing Policy and Strategy, Housing Secretariat. Thank you. Deanna, over to you.
Thanks, Leslie. So just to start off, good morning, everyone. As Leslie mentioned, I'm Deanna Chorley, and I was sitting in your shoes many, many years ago when I did my master's at York University, and always really welcome the opportunity to meet with students, hear your questions. I think it helps us in our work tremendously. I spent a lot of my career in the public service, both with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, Toronto Community Housing. I worked in our shelters division and then in city planning, and really value the opportunity to both tackle complex and really challenging problems, but also to make a difference in our city. And I think that's why we're all here today in terms of working in the public sector and helping you to learn about all that. So next slide, please. So I'll just talk really briefly a little bit about city planning, talk about our housing spectrum, and then I'm going to get into different tools that we're using within city planning to both incentivize new supply, unlock different types of supply, and then look at what levers we have to support affordable housing. Next slide. So city planning is really about developing long-range policies, initiatives, and programs that help to think about the future city we want, right? We're focused on making sure that as growth occurs, we're building complete communities, we're making sure that they're sustainable, that they're affordable, and that they're welcoming environments. We work very closely with our colleagues in what's called the Development Review Division. So at one time, there was one very large city planning division, and recently we've been split into two groups. But the intent there is that we collaborate very closely. So one group implements a lot of the programs and policies, and the other group, city planning, develops those initiatives. Next slide. So I'd like to talk about the housing spectrum or housing ecosystem, because I think it's important when you think about both what you're going to hear from Sinead and Mercedes, that we make interventions at all different points in that housing spectrum. So everything from shelters to market ownership. And some are really noticeable policies and programs, and others are about federal tax rules and that sort of thing. But it's helpful to think about that as an ecosystem and that they're all interrelated. Most of what city planning works on is related to market housing and some affordable housing. Mercedes will speak much more about interventions we make in terms of affordable housing. So just kind of, again, keeping that in mind in terms of this whole ecosystem approach. Next slide. So this slide I really like to highlight for two reasons. One is that housing prices are complex. And housing affordability is a complex piece that there's not one solution, right? So there are many different levers that you can think about that impact both supply factors and demand. And secondly, that when you think about these complex challenges, it's really about partnerships that need to happen. So whether we're thinking about how we're partnering with nonprofits and other orders of government, how we're partnering with trades who help to build housing, all of those pieces are critical when we think about these really complex problems and how we address them. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all the work we've been doing in terms of approving new supply in our city. So we track all of the different approvals, both at when they get an initial planning approval, so that means when they get their first zoning approval, so the box they can build, to when they have all the details ready and are about ready to build that final planning approval. On average, we've been approving close to 40,000 units each year that have a first planning approval. About half of those are built each year, right? So there is about double the amount that we approve that actually gets built. And part of that is because they still have to go through the process, and others is that they're waiting for a time when the market is ready to build. Those approvals are really good indication of sort of that near-term housing supply, what we're going to see in the next, 1 to 5 years, and what will come on the market soon. On this next slide is when you think about, just on the next slide, please. Thanks. There might be a delay for me, so I might say it twice. On the next slide is if you look at our whole city and what all of those approvals mean. So here you're looking at everything from Steeles down to the Lake, from the Rouge to basically the 427. And you can see that where we're seeing the most development are particularly in the downtown, in what we call our centers, so in Etobicoke, North York, Young Eglinton, and Scarborough, and that the scale of some of these projects is much bigger than we've seen in the past. Those large blue dot, or those large circles, indicate over 2,500 units in one singular proposed development. So in overall, when we look at everything that has been proposed, has been approved, or is under construction today, we have over 800,000 units in our pipeline. So that's a significant amount of supply. When that comes forward, again, there's different steps in the process. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight as well, just when we think about our overall supply, what that means when we talk about purpose-built rental housing. So you can see this slide is quite a bit different than the past slide, and part of that is where we're seeing most of the concentration in the downtown and a little bit in other areas of the city. And purpose-built rental housing is important because it represents a type of housing choice that really provides a security of tenure for folks that a condo rental doesn't, and other forms of housing doesn't. It's a really critical type of housing choice in our system. A lot of those dots on the map that are outside of the downtown are on sites where, it might be a tower in a park, so there's an existing building on the site, and they're looking to infill. So those aren't necessarily about new rental developments today, and we're thinking about how can we continue to support new rental. Next slide, please. So I want to just talk a little bit in terms of what we're doing to facilitate all of this new supply and think about different housing choices that we bring along as we unlock different planning tools. So on this next slide, one of the key initiatives that we've taken is called expanding housing options in neighborhoods. So not a super catchy term, but it's actually a very factual term in terms of what we're doing to think about how do we change some of the growth opportunities so they're not just focused on the downtown and the centers that I showed in those previous maps, but it's really about creating that quote-unquote missing middle housing. Some of you may have heard about the Yellow Belt and our neighborhoods, and that we need to provide more housing choice in those areas, and so that's what this initiative is doing. So next slide, please. So as part of the EHON, or Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods, I'll talk about 3 different projects that we're working on there for multiplexes, major streets, and laneway suites. And again, you kind of look at that highlighted yellow there, that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about different housing options. Next slide. So multiplexes are about, kind of smaller scale housing options that make good use of existing infrastructure. That means there's existing schools, there's community centers, parks already built into those existing neighborhoods, and it's often more ground-related housing that provides housing choice for folks at different stages in their life. So next slide. So here you can see one of the big changes we made is that previously 70% of our residential zones only permitted single detached homes to be built. They did allow secondary suites and so on, but really you can see a dramatic shift from what we had before, where only 70% allowed single detached, to now all of the city allows duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. So again, really providing more choice as of right, meaning that you can go and pull a building permit in many cases to build this type of housing. The other big piece is that there's more flexibility in terms of how that housing looks, so in terms of height and some of those performance measurements. And we also provided financial incentives by removing development charges for those 4 units on a lot. Next slide. The second piece is around major streets. So major streets aren't just, Yonge and Bloor, but many streets within our city are considered major streets. And here what we've done is we've said that along those major streets, as of right, meaning again, you can hopefully pull a building permit or just have some minor variances, you can build up to 6 stories and 60 units. So that's really what we think about is, that modest scale, lower mid-rise type of form. And that's a significant shift in terms of different housing options that we're supporting. We've also permitted townhouses in all residential detached zones in the city. So again, continuing those incremental changes to making sure that there's more housing choices in our city. And the last, on this next slide, the last initiative I want to highlight is what we've called changing lanes, which is a bit more of a catchy term than EHON. And here, this is really about thinking about our existing laneway infrastructure and how do we make better use of that by allowing different housing options. So you can think about, having an opportunity to have a rental unit in facing laneway in a backyard, or more opportunities for more multi-generational housing. So really unlocking some of those opportunities. So on this next slide, I'm just going to highlight some of the other work we're doing, thinking ahead to major growth areas, and this is about really long-term planning. So, excuse me, when I talk about our pipeline and I talk about some of the EHON initiatives, that's stuff that we're hoping to see in the next 5 years. Some of these other areas are really longer term horizon and about thinking about growth in a much different scale. So on this next slide, this is just a snapshot of all the different studies we're looking at in the city. So everywhere from Scarborough to Mount Dennis, Downsview and so on. And this is really about thinking about how are we building new planning frameworks that are going to support that growth and bring all that other important infrastructure along the way. So I just highlight a couple. For Downsview, we have looked at an overall planning framework that will support 110,000 new residents. So, think about a town like Peterborough coming into the city of Toronto and making sure we get the schools, we get the daycares, we get the community centers and so on to make sure we're actually getting a really great livable community. We're also looking at and working in Scarborough at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus plan and thinking about how do we support new student residences and make sure that we get the planning right there as well. On this next slide, just give you a little snapshot of this area in the Golden Mile. So this is in Scarborough, and really interesting to see just a change from what was previously a very low residential commercial employment zone to what will soon have over 37,000 new residents, 66,000 new residents and 37,000 new units. So a dramatic change. You can see some significant height there. And just helpful to think about all that work as you see that low scale around, and then what will really change, and particularly as the LRT comes in, there'll be a dramatically new neighborhood. On the next slide, I wanted to highlight some of the work we're doing looking at existing mall sites. So, we know often neighborhood malls are focal points in terms of for communities to gather and so on, but they're really about a certain daytime use. They also were often constructed in a time where there was a lot of surface parking lot for cars, a lot of extra space. And so we have about 20 mall sites that are looking to redevelop in the city. Some of them are huge, large-scale redevelopments. Some of them will just be adding small amount of residential, but this will be transitioning these neighborhoods from just a daytime use to being complete communities where you have residential, you have shopping, and you have all those other amenities. So on this next slide, this just gives you a little visual of what some of those mall sites would look like today and in the future. So for instance, Cloverdale Mall here, you can see very flat, intersected by two major highways, and in the future would have a large park, would have a lot of residential, and it would be a full-scale redevelopment of that site versus Woodside Square, which is in Scarborough. Again, very flat and close to a lot of roads, but would keep a mall and then add some residential. Either way, these are, I think, really interesting things or sites to look at, to think about how do we reimagine our existing neighborhoods. So the next section I'll talk about is what we're doing within city planning and what tools we have to think about how we're supporting our existing affordable housing stock and supporting new. One of the big challenges we have is we have certain tools, but our tools are absolutely limited by the province, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So on this next slide, we have looked at what is affordable housing. And I know affordable housing and that term means a lot of different things to different folks. And that gets back to that housing spectrum, right? And thinking about what is affordable when you're, living in a shelter versus in market ownership can be very subjective. But what we at the city have done when we talk about affordable is want to peg that to household incomes, to what people can actually afford. So we did some work to make sure that if you're a single person who needs a one-bedroom apartment, that your income, so looking at kind of all household incomes, it would be 60th percentile of all renter household incomes, and that's how we would make affordable rents for a one-bedroom. So what this means is that we're really focusing on key workers in the city. So you can see here that we're supporting folks like an early childhood educator and a bank clerk who have 2 kids are able to afford a 3-bedroom rental unit in the city. And similarly, a dental assistant could afford a 1-bedroom based on our affordable rents. So on this next slide, thank you, I want to talk a little bit about the policy requirements we use when we look at what happens when there's redevelopment with existing tenants in the city. So we take a number of different interventions, making sure if there's even one unit that's going to be lost as part of a redevelopment, that household is provided with financial assistance to help lessen the hardship that they face having to move. Where there's at least 6 units in a project, we would make sure that they're provided with that financial assistance, but also that their unit would be replaced and they would be able to live in their community after that that project is redeveloped. So on this next slide, this is just talking a little bit more about that piece. You may have heard the term demoviction, and what we've seen in the city is a significant increase in the number of demevictions happening. Probably 10 years ago, we would have about half its number of applications that came in that we see today. The city has a very robust and strong policy framework that addresses this, and it's been in place for a long time. And so what we require, where, again, there's 6 or more rental units that will be lost due to redevelopment, we make sure that the same size, the same type, the same number of units are replaced in a development, and that those rents are similar to what is in effect today. So that means that tenants are able to move back to a replacement unit. It means that we're keeping some of that affordability in that community after redevelopment. Important to note that these policy frameworks, they're not intended to prevent new development, they're intended to help mitigate those effects of new development. On this next slide, I also want to highlight, we've also brought in a policy that's focused on dwelling rooms or multi-tenant housing that also requires replacement of that type of housing. And that's really critical because dwelling rooms are really the kind of lowest price or lowest end of that housing continuum in terms of market rental, right? So often the most affordable for folks and often can have some of the most vulnerable tenants in it. And so we've looked to make sure, again, that that space associated with those dwelling rooms are replaced and that folks are assisted in terms of both finding new housing and being able to move back. So I wanted to conclude with this last slide, just going back to the big message that at the end of the day, within planning, we only have the powers that the province gives us. And so that has meant, we can have very bold policies, and I think we've seen a strong mandate from council to bring forward very progressive and bold policies. However, there's certain things that we can't do until the province approves it. And so one example is inclusionary zoning, which would require affordable housing as part of new developments. Our city council approved a comprehensive inclusionary zoning policy framework, and we've now been waiting for, I think, over 2 years for the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to approve what are called protected major transit station areas that would allow us to implement inclusionary zoning around those transit station areas. We also use what's called a community benefits charge to secure new affordable housing. So we previously had something called density bonusing, that some of you may be familiar with that term. And what the province said is, okay, yes, it's important to secure new community infrastructure when new development happens, but we're going to cap the amount of money that you can collect. So it's set at 4% of the total land value, which means that we're only able to secure a small amount of, let's say, affordable housing or maybe a childcare, whereas in the past, under density bonusing, we could get much more affordable housing along with that childcare. The last piece I would just highlight that we use when we're thinking about affordable housing is on large sites. So like on those mall sites in our waterfront, we say that our first priority is to secure affordable housing in that new development. So of all those different community benefits, we know affordable housing is the critical one. Again, we are at the whim of the province, and that, you know, that CBC, the community benefits charge cap of 4%, really limits what we can do, but we continue to advocate, and we work really closely with our colleagues in the Housing Secretariat to see if we can layer on the city's own financial incentives to do more on those sites. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sinead, and thank you.
Thank you, Deanna, and particularly for calling to our attention the concept of the housing spectrum, and within it, how we can explore non-traditional housing types to meet the housing needs. I'm going to turn the time now to Sinead from the Toronto Shelter and Support Services.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm so happy to be here today, and I appreciate all of you for making the time to come here or to see us online. I'm Sinead Canavan, the Project Director of Issues Management in the General Manager's Office in the Toronto Shelter and Support Services Division at the City of Toronto. My role, I'm going to give you a little bit about me and my role. It's a unique one at the City because I support our division and our work with the councillors' offices, overseeing milestones and adherence to the processes for our staff reports, the submissions and their reviews, and I support our senior management and extended management teams with issues that come up. As my title suggests, it's a broad thing that can happen. I have one staff person with a public relations background, and our main thrust of our work is to work with our colleagues in strategic public and employee communications for our division's communication needs with media and our web presence. Basically, if people in our division aren't sure what to do, they call me, and I do what I can to help them out. But my background, I guess, is what's unique. I have a diploma in public relations from Humber College, and I liked Humber so much I went back and did a postgraduate in marketing management. And the main reason for that is because I thought in the non-for-profit sector, I could get more work having a bit of a marketing and communications background. This is my 10th year at the City of Toronto, and I'm just coming on 4 years in the Toronto Shelter, TS3, it's easier to say that. My first job at the city was in a similar role in the Engineering and Construction Services Division. So I've come from both sides of the city's work. And that was a 6-year break from my 4 years that I spent working on both internal communications and issues management at Toronto Community Housing. So I feel like all of my 10 years previous have culminated into this magical role here in Toronto Shelter and Support Services. So while my education set me up for this opportunity at the city, I think what also helped me do this work is the fact that I worked in hospitality and the service sector along the way, and those customer-facing experiences certainly shaped my work with people, and I think has enabled me to create a unique niche here in my work at the city. So your academic pursuits may be one lane, but all of the other work you're doing outside of academia may help you find an interesting career path at the city, and I thought this would be a good chance to share that with you because everyone's journey is different. So now on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Just a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Our division, the shelter system demands and the background of it, some current initiatives we're working on, and what's next. I did share with our team some resources and links so that you can just find some of this background information after the fact. So that's there for you. Next slide, please. So 2 things before we start. First, I want to pause and reflect on the fact that the statistics that I'll be sharing with you are about people, and our work is people-focused, and it's always important to think about the fact that any numbers I'm talking about are about people experiencing homelessness, and just want to give pause and reflect on that. And the other thing is the fact that anyone who's seen other civic labs, our division name underwent a change earlier this year. We were known as the Shelter, Support and Housing Administration. And in early 2024, we changed our name to the Toronto Shelter and Support Services Division. And that's mainly because our focus, our team that was responsible for housing moved over to the Housing Secretariat, and our work became solely focused on people experiencing homelessness, including encampments, so people living outside, and our work with people in shelters. So I just wanted to set that stage for you if you're wondering, who's this crazy new division? We just have a new name. We're still doing the same work. So the shelter system is currently serving twice as many people as it was 6 years ago. The City of Toronto offers more shelter beds per capita than any other Canadian municipality, while delivering person-centered, outcome-focused support to help individuals improve the overall well-being of individuals experiencing homelessness and help them find and keep safe, stable, affordable housing as quickly as possible. We have 100 shelter sites in the City of Toronto. 19 are operated by the city, and 81 are funded by the city but operated by partners. All of these sites are staffed 24/7. They provide wraparound supports and services, including meals and laundry, case managers to assist with developing permanent housing plans, and harm reduction supports. The city continues to experience an unprecedented demand for shelter space. The housing and affordability crises, insufficient mental health supports, income supports that haven't kept pace with rising cost of living, the drug toxicity crisis, and the record number of refugee claimants arriving in the city that need emergency shelter are all contributing to the strain we're experiencing. Next slide, please. In May 2023, City Council declared a homelessness emergency, joining other municipalities that made similar declarations. In 2023, we provided emergency shelter to nearly 22,000 unique individuals, and we helped 5,900 more people move from shelter into permanent housing. On screen is a nightly snapshot from last Monday. You can see that we supported more than 12,200 people in overnight spaces. This included 9,605 beds in our shelter system and more than 2,600 spaces in bridging hotels. Bridging hotels are not shelter spaces. They are spaces where people are staying with no support while waiting to get into the shelter system. The vast majority of the people in those spaces are families with children. With this news, the city expects shelter demand to continue to rise in the final months of the year and into 2025. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of our budget in 2023, and when we look at what we're spending in 2024, it's about $9 million more, so about $787 million. $750 million of the city's budget is committed to homelessness services in the city. And 60% of that is funded by the city's tax base. So you can see that we're not alone in the City of Toronto funding it, but we certainly aren't shouldering the brunt of it. And we do rely on supports from the federal and provincial governments to do this work. Next slide, please. In 2021, the city completed its street needs assessment of people experiencing homelessness. In this survey, we do a count of people experiencing homelessness outside and indoors, and we ask them questions to learn more about what their experiences are and how we can shape our work. The 2024 survey is underway now. What we learned in 2021 was that People experiencing homelessness needed more supportive and deeply affordable housing units, and they've consistently told us that they, being people experiencing homelessness, have told us that they want permanent housing. 80% of respondents noted that the most important services help them find housing were those related to affordability and income. And we do know that the number of people becoming homeless continues to outpace the number of people moving out of homelessness and into permanent housing. If you recall, we talked about 5,900 people getting housed last year, and we're still helping 12,000 people each night. So that's a bit of a disconnect. Next slide, please. So in our work in the shelter system, our goal is a housing-focused system that connects people to available housing as quickly as possible. This chart explains our work through a coordinated access approach. It's a proven best practice internationally, sorry, that's a lot of P's, internationally, and we're modernizing our approach and improving systems to assess needs and prioritize access to the right supportive housing options to improve housing outcomes and reduce chronic homelessness. The idea of our work is to help people before they're in the shelter system for more than 6 months, but our data is telling us that more and more people are reaching an unfortunate milestone, which is that they've been in the shelter system for more than 6 months. Next slide, please. Again, more data from our 2021 Street Needs Assessment. This proves that homelessness is not a downtown problem. In this assessment in 2021, we can see that only about 30% of the people were downtown, and the remaining 70% were across the city. So when we look at our planning work and where we're looking to support and build new shelters and do our work, it's in the areas outside of the downtown core. Next slide, please. With better understanding of homelessness and the shelter system and services in Toronto, let's talk about some of the initiatives that Toronto Shelter and Support Services is leading this year. So we talked about pressures on the shelter system. In addition to those, we are seeing more encampments across the city. The longer people stay outside, the greater the likelihood of poor health outcomes and more challenging it is to facilitate connections to housing. The small chart on the left indicates that in 2022, in October, there were just under 200 encampments across the city. And in October 24, that number is about 500. That's quite an increase of people who are living outdoors. In 2023, our outreach staff attended encampment locations 5,268 times. They referred 880 people into the shelter system and helped 155 people secure permanent housing from the street. They didn't even go into a shelter. They moved from a park or another outdoor space. In June, Council approved the Toronto Shelter and Support Services encampment approach. This was the culmination of work in the city's response to the Ombudsman's reports on encampments from 2022 and 2023. The city's strategic approach to encampments is grounded in a human rights approach to help people access indoor spaces while supporting the needs of the surrounding community. This work isn't done alone by the team at Toronto Shelter and Support Services. It is a collective work of several divisions across the city. It represents a shift from an enforcement-focused approach to one that involves outreach, collaboration, and exhausting available tools to help people from encampments move indoors. And the 4 pillars are spelled out here. Next slide, please. A core component of the work to develop the strategy and in delivering a human rights-based approach is centering the experience on the people who live in encampments. And we heard from them, and these are the things they told us. They want clear pathways out of homelessness. They think our current shelters feel unsafe or unable to meet their needs. They have a hard time accessing basic needs. They need a better understanding of how they'll be engaged in the work that is about them and for them. And they want to be part of the solutions that we're working towards. we did a lot of engagement on this work, and a lot of it included people with lived experience of encampments. So we heard firsthand from those individuals as we worked on this plan. Next slide, please. A big proponent, or one of the biggest pieces of our work around the encampment strategy, is the interdivisional protocol for encampments in Toronto. And this work is about explaining the roles of the several city divisions that play a part in supporting people living in encampments in our work in our work to resolve them for the community. It's our partners at solid waste, parks, transportation, Toronto Police, the encampment office, our Streets to Homes team, just to name a few. This document spells out the process and was approved by council, and these are some of the areas that this document spells out and allows us to adhere to it. But the big part about this protocol is that it is designed to be adaptive and iterative, and we'll learn from our experiences as we continue to support people in encampments. Next slide, please. So this slide just proves that we're doing a lot of work, or spells out some of our work beyond the two things that I chose to highlight today. You know, some of it started in the pandemic, or obviously before the pandemic, but we decided to keep the list short. In 2020, we implemented the Integrated Prevention and Harm Reduction Initiative, and this is about supporting people experiencing homelessness to keep them safe as a result of the opioid crisis we're in the midst of. We released a 3-year homelessness solution services plan in 2021, and that was guiding our division and homelessness service system in achieving our goals over the 3 years between 2021 to this year. We also released our COVID-19 shelter transition and relocation plan. I'll get to that more in our next item. And earlier this year, we released our collaboration with CAMH, which is a shelter safety study, helping us to develop and come up with our shelter safety action plan, which we will be delivering or proposing to council later this month. So we're looking forward to that work. It's been a lot. And we hear from people outside that they don't feel safe in shelter, and we have concerns about staff. So this is really good work putting that feedback out into a new plan to help support our initiatives. Next slide, please. So this is probably the one that's most like the work our colleagues in city planning are leading and the Housing Secretariat. It's the Homelessness Solutions Capital Infrastructure Strategy. It's quite the mouthful. HSIS for short, it's what we call it around the office. And it's a 10-year plan to improve shelter system stability, achieve cost savings, and be more responsive to the needs of people experiencing homelessness. So in the pandemic, you may or may not have seen the news, the city took extraordinary measures to ensure people experiencing homelessness were safe. Our open environment dormitory style shelters were not necessarily designed to support people in a pandemic. So we took drastic action to increase the number of spaces and move those people into different types of spaces. Many of them were hotels. We've left since a number of those hotels, but we're still in 17. And in doing our analysis about the spaces we were using, we realized a lot of our shelter space and shelter system, more than 50%, were in spaces that we were renting without a long-term lease. So it's kind of ironic that the team of people that's there to help people in an emergency build some stability to get into housing itself isn't built on a stable ground and in a stable setting to support these individuals. So we created worked on this HSIS plan, which was approved in November 2023 and has since had a number of steps towards its implementation. In early 2024, we got approval from council to extend the leases at the hotels that we were in, that we needed to stay in, for up to 5 years to buy us some of that stability while we work to build new space. The HSIS strategy is about building 20 new shelter locations across the city, as noted, not downtown necessarily, but across the city of Toronto in right-size shelter spaces. Right-size shelter is about locations that are about 80 beds and maybe have more unique specific services for the people we're serving to better meet their goals and to support them to gain their stability and move towards housing more effectively. So this work is well underway, and our efforts at sourcing new locations is also underway, and we look to have more to come in this news about this strategy. That's it. Next slide, please. So what's next for us? As I mentioned earlier, we are in the midst of our 2024 street needs assessment. You'll notice I talked a lot about the results of the 2021 survey, and this new one will help us plan our next wave of work. We expect the results of this to happen in 2025. As we speak, literally, we're finalizing the outdoor surveys that took place of people living outdoors, and last week were the people in shelter. We're also developing our 2025 to 2030 strategic plan. So this is another roadmap of our work as a division and a service system for the next 5 years. This plan will help us improve homelessness prevention measures, increase pathways to housing, and ensure comprehensive supports are in place for people who need the system. Again, I mentioned our staff report coming in November about the Shelter Safety Action Plan. This is a big piece of our work. We're really excited about it. So I know I don't sound excited, but I am. And that's coming in a couple of weeks. So that'll be hot off the press later this month if you have any interest. And then, as mentioned, the next steps in the Homelessness Solutions Capital Infrastructure Strategy, which is about finding those locations, talking to community, and working to build and open new sites. And then next slide, please. So as I noted in the beginning of this talk, I'm just one lucky person to help support a team of people, more than 1,200 other workers who do the hardest work, I think, in the city. And they deliver our frontline services in shelters, they answer calls in our essential intake line, or they do outreach to people living outdoors and encampments. And I just wanted to take a minute to recognize them for their great work, supporting people experiencing homelessness in Toronto, and thank you for your time this morning.
I believe it was the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead who said that the mark of civilization is how its people treat and cares for its needy. So thank you, Sinead, for reminding us of our duty. I'm going to turn the time lastly to Ms. Sadie from the Housing Secretariat.
Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thanks for being here this morning with us talking about housing. My name is Mercedes Madani. I'm the Acting Director of Housing Policy and Strategy at the City of Toronto's Housing Secretariat. My background is in urban planning and urban design, but I have dedicated my career to housing and addressing the housing needs of our most vulnerable residents in our city. And I feel very lucky, to be honest, listening to Deanna and Sinead today about the amazing work that they do across their divisions and their teams to tackle these challenges and these very, very complicated challenges. Before I go through my presentation, I wanted to give you a little bit an overview of the Housing Secretariat and what we do in our office. We have 3 main functions. One, which is the team that I'm part of, is the Housing Policy and Strategy team. We develop policies, programs, and strategies to really get to the gaps in our housing system and help mostly low-income and moderate-income households in our city get access to housing that meets their needs. Our work is very much informed by data. We have a lot of housing data nerds in our team. And we also work in partnership with a lot of our nonprofit, private sector organizations. We work with organizations that serve Indigenous residents, women, gender diverse people, Black and racialized residents. So we work with them because they know much better than we do the real needs and challenges of these populations. And we also work at the policy team a lot with other orders of government. We make sure that the policies and the strategies that we develop meet the priorities of other orders of government, and that's how we can secure government funding from those orders of government. Is this better? Okay. We have a development team that basically takes all of the policies and programs that we develop and puts them into action. They either develop housing directly or fund nonprofit and private organizations to build a range of housing options. So that includes supportive housing, social housing, affordable rental, and affordable ownership housing. They also focus on preservation and protection of our existing supply through acquisitions or repairs and renewals. And the largest team in our division really focuses on administration of housing as well as improving housing stability for residents. We know that there are many residents in our city that struggle with paying their rent. They are at risk of being evicted. So the housing stability team in our office works directly with tenants or with organizations that serve tenants to make sure that they can remain housed. And they also administer all of these new social and affordable housing projects that we develop to make sure that they can continue to serve not only their current residents, but the future generations. We do this work in close collaboration with TS3 and city planning because we want to make sure that the policies, the programs, and the housing that we create, first and foremost, relieve some pressure from the shelter system, can be successful for people moving out of homelessness, but that they're also meeting our planning requirements and they meet the best standards and regulations under the Planning Act. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Housing TO 2020-2030 action plan. That is the plan that guides our work at the Housing Secretariat. And also want to talk to you about this exciting project that we're working on right now, which is around developing an academic housing strategy. Next slide. I've been using this code quite a bit actually in my presentations lately, so you might have seen some versions of this elsewhere, because I really think it's important to really put our housing and homelessness challenges into context. Sinead talked brilliantly about the challenges that our people experiencing homelessness face every day. But what we're also seeing is that a lot more of our middle income earners are facing very similar challenges. They cannot find homes that meet their needs, that is affordable to them in places that they're looking for, near services, near transit, near schools. And these two housing and homelessness crises that we have, they have intersecting factors, but they need different policy solutions. Next slide. And these policy solutions not only have to look at our current housing need, but they also have to look at how our housing needs is changing over time and in the future so that we're ready. One of the biggest pressures that we have right now is around population growth. So Toronto has a population of about 3 million people right now. We are expected to grow to over 4 million by 2031. We have our country as a whole has very ambitious immigration targets. Just last week, the federal government, in recognition of the pressure on the population pressures on the social services, on the housing and infrastructure, actually reduced its immigration targets for the next 3 years. They introduced a pause, a short-term pause, and they reduced their immigration target for the next 3 years, while the country as a whole starts to catch up on building housing infrastructure that can meet the needs of our growing population. And I'm seeing a lot of debate already about this, about the economic impact of this decision specifically, so we'll be watching this very closely in the coming months. Next slide. But it's really in this dynamic environment and fast-changing environment that we developed the Housing TO 2020-2030 Action Plan. So that's our 10-year housing plan that includes a range of actions across the housing continuum. Deanna talked about the housing continuum earlier on. So you can see that we have different segments of the housing sector or housing continuum represented here, from shelters to supportive housing, social housing, to affordable rental and ownership housing, and all the way to market housing, which is more within the jurisdiction of city planning. But really the Housing TO plan tries to cover a range of actions across the housing continuum, because we recognize that not everyone is at the same place in their housing journey. They all have different needs based on where they are in their journey, and they need access to safe, secure, adequate, and affordable housing, regardless of their income and background. Next slide. So the Housing TO plan has 13 key strategic themes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but really what the plan intends to do and the outcomes that we really want to get out of the Housing TO plan is really around creating new supply, protecting and preserving what we currently have in our housing system, supporting renters. About half of our households in Toronto are renters, and that number just continues to grow. So we want to make sure that we have specific actions to support renters and improve their housing stability. We also recognize that people have diverse housing needs, especially when you look at, again, priority populations, indigenous communities, Black and racialized communities, people experiencing homelessness, women and gender diverse people. They all have diverse housing needs. So we do need to take those very, very specific populations into consideration as we're planning and implementing our housing plan. And we also want to make sure our housing policies continue to be updated and be transformed as our housing system changes and as our environment, especially at the federal and provincial level, change. Next slide, please. So one of the pieces that I really wanted to focus on today, and it came up in different ways in Deanna's and Sinead's presentations, is around Toronto Housing Charter. So the Housing TO Action Plan is the first municipal housing plan that actually has that recognizes housing as a human right, and it basically says, and I definitely encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested in this. I go and read this every month or so, just because it is a good reminder for us in terms of why we're doing the work that we're doing. So it recognizes adequate housing as a fundamental human right that is recognized in international law, and that all orders of government, including municipalities, have a role to play in advancing the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. So what this means in day-to-day business for us is that we need to incorporate this lens into our housing policy development, program development, and even in budget decisions that we make. So Sinead talked about the encampment strategy and how the new approach is actually based on that human right lens. The city also has established a human rights advisory committee. This is a committee of council that includes members of the community, people with lived experience, but also experts on the housing field, to look at the housing issues that the city faces, and they can provide independent and direct advice to council about what they're seeing in the housing system. They're actually meeting on Monday, 9 a.m. here at City Hall, if anyone's interested to attend or watch online. And we now also have a Deputy Ombudsman of Housing, which their role is specifically to look at the systematic housing issues in our city, to look at discrimination and to really monitor the work of the city independently to see if the work that we're doing is aligned with Toronto Housing Charter or not. Next slide, please. So as I said, again, when we developed the Housing TO Action Plan in 2019, it started in 2020, we were hit with a global pandemic. So since then, we had to continue to respond to the changing needs in our city. So starting in 2022, when we started moving towards recovery, we introduced the Housing Action Plan 2020-2026, which not only builds on the Housing TO Action Plan and its priorities, but it also enables market and non-market and mixed housing production so that we can meet provincial housing targets. The province basically assigned new housing targets to all of the municipalities and service managers in Ontario. Toronto, the lucky one, we have to do 285,000 housing starts by 2030 to meet the provincial target. So we needed to make sure that the work that we do after that new target was established will get us to meet that target by 2030, or at least get us as close as possible. So as a result of that, and in follow-up to that, later in 2023, we wanted to make sure not only that we're building or we're incentivizing and creating new housing, but we're also focusing on affordable housing and supportive housing. So we actually expanded our affordable housing targets from 40,000 affordable rental homes to 65,000 rent control homes. And I can talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So as I said, the City of Toronto has a target of 285,000 housing starts. That's the provincial housing targets that the city has committed to deliver. As part of the Housing TO plan, we want to make sure at least 65,000 of those units are rent controlled. And that means about 47,500 as affordable rental. So that's what we call housing that's affordable to our middle income earners. And then 17,500 rent-controlled market homes. As you know, and as you might know, in 2018-19, the province removed rent control from our housing system. So all the new rental housing that's been created, there's no rent control over it. So the landlords can increase the rent at any rate that they would like on an annual basis. So what we're doing is to create a new system and a new program that incentivizes rental housing development to maintain the rent at provincial guidelines, basically, on an annual basis. So that means that if you rent one of these properties or one of these rent-controlled homes, you have a better security of tenure and rent, so that you are not faced with very high and unexpected rent increases on an annual basis at the whim of the landlords. And our affordable rental homes now is broken down into 41,000 affordable and 6,500 rent geared to income. So that means that for people who are very low income, who are in receipt of, for example, Ontario Works or Ontario Disability Support Services, they can only pay, or they will only pay 30% of their income or only the shelter allowance of their OW and ODSP towards rent, so that they have the rest of their benefit and income for other basic necessities in their lives, like transit, clothing, education, and so on. So those are our kind of the most deeply affordable types of homes that we can create. They're also the most expensive type of homes that we need additional funding for, plus the 40,000 affordable rental homes, which what we usually commonly call refer to as workforce housing. Next slide. So these are really big targets, really big numbers. The City of Toronto on its own cannot build 65,000 new rent-controlled homes or reach the 285,000 housing starts. So we really need a whole of government and whole of community approach to addressing the homelessness and housing challenges that our residents face. And you can see here, these partners include not only other orders of government, but also in Toronto and the region, we need to work with our regional partners. We need to work with our nonprofit and private housing organizations. But as we're talking more about how housing is a social determinant of health, we also need to work with our health partners. We also need to work with our business partners, because the type of housing that we're creating, what we call the workforce housing, is actually going to house the workforce in our city that will then need to basically be there to run services, to provide services, to run the city and provide services to our residents. So with that, I think I really want to get to our next portion of the presentation, which is the academic housing strategy. I arrived in Toronto as an international student. I lived in a dorm until I couldn't afford to pay the dorm fees because it was very expensive. I lived in basement, so this is very near and dear to my heart to be able for the first time to talk about the housing needs and challenges of students in our city. So this is something that we haven't done before. We're really excited about it, and that's why it's really important for us to talk to you a little bit more about what we have done so far, and make sure that you have a chance to participate in this exercise as well. Next slide. So we estimate that there are 300,000 students who are enrolled in post-secondary institutions in Toronto. This means that there's a high demand for affordable housing for post-secondary students, but also for faculty and staff, because we can't have really strong or successful education institutions if we don't have the right talents to teach at these schools or the staff to run these schools. So as part of the Housing Action Plan, one of the directions that we got was to develop a post-secondary housing strategy that looks at the housing needs of students, but also really investigates what does affordable housing mean for students. We have been working with academic partners across the 8 academic institutions in Toronto for the past year or so to prepare for the release of this strategy. And if you go to the next slide, really what we're doing right now is around engagement. So we have launched our online survey that we would get to. We have been doing in-person engagement sessions at all universities and colleges. We have been working with a really, really small but very talented group of student outreach team who have helped us make that connection with the students. And then we will be doing key informant interviews, focus groups with the students and with faculty and staff. And we have a very innovative consultation in a box tool that we also want to talk to you a little bit more. Next slide. So one of the reasons I'm here is to encourage you to do this online survey. You can see the QR code here, but after the session, you can also go up. There's a barcode there that you can scan and fill out the survey. It takes about 7 to 10 minutes, but really is our way to be able to understand a little bit more about your housing needs, your housing challenges, what are your priorities, what is affordable housing, what does it mean to you, and also what is on your wish list for student housing. Next slide. We have already been to all of these institutions at least once. So you can see starting in on October 1st, basically, we have been to all of these institutions to do an in-person drop-in session where students had an opportunity to come visit us and give us their input. We're doing a mini engagement session similar to what we have been doing at the university and colleges here today. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see some photos of the type of input that we have been able to gather so far, not only through sticky notes, but people have been recording video messages for us so that we can hear from them firsthand what their housing experience is like. Next slide. So consultation in a box, again, we realize that sometimes people need different ways of sharing their feedback with us. So if people haven't been able to attend an in-person session or do the online survey, there's also an opportunity for you to receive a package from our consultant so that you can run your own consultation. And this is a photo of one of these engagement in a box sessions that was facilitated by a student. You can gather, about 10 of your friends, your peers, and go through the questions and have a conversation and send us the results. There's a small kind of honorarium attached to this so that you can either if you have to make prints or get food or refreshments for your consultation, you can use that honorarium to do that. But again, available. If anyone's interested, please let us know. We're happy to send this to you. And next slide. So in terms of our timeline, again, we have been working for almost a year on doing the prep work. We're now in fall of 2024 doing engagement. When the engagement kind of period or duration is done, we're going to focus our energy and time on data analysis. So that's what we'll be doing in winter, drafting recommendations in collaboration with our academic partners. And then we're hoping to bring the strategy forward in Q1 of 2025 to committee and council. Next slide. And in terms of next steps, as I said, we're continuing to do engagement. We have more in-person sessions that we're planning, especially for the Scarborough campuses. So if there are students here from Scarborough campuses, you'll have another opportunity to see the team when they come to your institution. We'll do more analysis, and then, as I said, we'll do the reporting to committee and council that will kind of share what we have heard as part of our engagement, a summary of the data analysis that we have done, and also specific recommendations, not only for the city, but for other orders of government and for academic institutions in terms of how we can all work collaboratively to address housing needs of students. And we really want to encourage you today, after we do our Q&A, to participate in our engagement session. So I have my colleagues here at the top row. Wave, guys, over there. Please go up the stairs. There are some boards and some questions that we have that we would love to hear from you. And any other suggestion or recommendations that you have for us, we would love to hear from you directly. And with that, thank you again for having me, and I'll give it over to Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to let us know about the outreach program, Mercedes. I'm just going to open the time now to you students, those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us virtually. If there are any questions you have for our presenters. I see a hand over there. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you guys for your presentation. I had a question about laneway housing and multiplexes. So laneway housing and multiplexes have kind of been touted as a solution to Toronto's missing middle and housing crisis. And despite the allowance and celebration of these housing types, the city stopped offering forgivable loans for affordable housing in 2022 because not enough people were wanting to build affordable laneway housing. Subsequently, there's kind of been a backlash and resistance in certain neighborhoods where residents have attributed laneway housing with the fear of gentrification because commercial developers have been purchasing and developing laneway housing for market rents which are unaffordable. So what can the city do, or what is the city doing to develop missing middle solutions without contributing to gentrification and further income polarization? Thank you.
Thanks. You seem very informed about these issues, so appreciate the question. I'm going to start and then pass it over to Mercedes. So I think one important piece to note is that the EHON and adding housing options as part of laneway housing or multiplexes, that isn't about affordability. I mean, absolutely, when we think about that housing spectrum, all those housing choices have an impact in overall affordability, but it wasn't as a strategy, it's not intended to offer more deeply affordable housing. And part of that is actually just the financials, right? Having one unit at that scale, it's really challenging to make that affordable. But having more housing options mean there's more folks who are able to live in a community that I would, my own personal opinion, would say doesn't lead to gentrification. But Mercedes can talk a little bit about some of the work we have done to think about affordability.
Yeah, I completely agree with Deanna. I think we have to, and I think it goes back to the whole housing spectrum, right? Like we need housing options, including affordable housing. And I think there should be a recognition that affordable housing, building affordable housing in the city's hot housing market comes with a price. All orders of government have invested in affordable housing over the the past decades, in some decades more than the other ones. And when it comes to, when it comes to the city's specific actions on affordable housing, we have used all of our very limited tools around waivers of fees and charges for affordable rental housing. However, again, it sometimes works for some projects, for smaller scale projects where your soft cost necessarily doesn't, if your soft cost is pretty much the same if you're building an apartment building or a laneway home, right? Or very small differences. So at the end of the day, the financials don't work. The other piece that we're dealing with specifically to that program that you mentioned is that the province actually waived development charges for secondary homes as part of their legislation a couple of years ago. So that changed our program parameters because that was what we're doing in the absence of any additional incentives from the province. We are still providing waivers of fees, charges, property taxes for affordable housing through our new rental housing supply program, which used to be called the Open Door program. So we still provide these incentives to affordable housing developments in laneway homes in very small scale projects. The financials just don't add up, and we acknowledge that. But again, I don't think it should take away from the fact that laneway housing or garden suites are still adding to our housing options and gentle density to our neighborhoods.
Thank you. I see a hand right here in the front, and then we'll go to you guys. Thank you, guys. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there was a slide that looked at family incomes, and I'm just curious what sort of math went into the budget, because I'm looking at one of the points was a family making approximately $100,000 a year being able to afford a $2,800 a month rent. Now that could be about 40% or more, depending on how they're taxed. Like when we look at, you know, there's a difference between the gross and the net, right? Like they're making $100,000 a year, but they're not keeping $100,000 a year. So how are these families? Maybe they have daycare costs, which could be quite high, even with the $10 a day. Maybe they have other kinds of childcare related costs. They need to save for emergencies. You know, they need to afford groceries. So to me, it seems like this is pushing close to the 50% mark potentially, and also not giving them that buffer. So, you know, keeping in mind, obviously, the affordability crisis is huge, and it's tough to sort of look at all these different incomes. But I guess I'm sure there's a lot more behind that slide. But I'm curious, like what information or what research, what kind of budget was being looked at when we consider a family with $100,000 affording an almost $3,000 unit, paying utilities, paying for a phone, paying for internet access, paying for transit. So if anyone could elaborate on that, I'd be curious to know what stats went behind that.
Yeah. So the switch to having an income-based definition of affordable housing was actually in recognition of the fact that previously our definition of affordable housing was tied to average market rents, which was completely out of context when it came to what our households can pay in real life. So we did an exercise with city planning over the past couple of years to switch from a market-based definition of affordable housing to an income-based definition of affordable housing. Our current definitions are based on 30% of the income for renter households in 50th or 60th percentile. So that was the math that kind of defined the definition of affordable housing. With that said, affordable housing is not rent geared to income housing. Rent geared to income housing is where your rent is tied to 30% of your income, so you have the rest of your income available, as you said, to pay for childcare, education, transit, and other, basic necessities. Building rent geared to income, similar to building affordable housing income, requires significant public investment, not only to build housing, but also throughout the operation of the buildings, so that the buildings can continue to remain not only affordable, but also at a state of good repair. So unfortunately, we do not have the government programs that we used to have in the 60s and 70s that would pay for 100% capital cost of building rent geared to income housing. We do not have the programs that would help maintain the rents at a rent geared to income, so that if people's income changes, their rent changes with it. In the absence of those government programs, we're now focusing on building affordable housing, which, again, they're not deeply affordable. They are not necessarily affordable to people coming out of homelessness, for example, or low-income households. They are filling a gap for workforce housing, but the benefit, again, that it provides is that your rent is set for the new tenant, your rent is set at, again, the affordable rents as defined, and that your rent is also controlled. So year over year, your rent can only increase by the provincial guidelines amount. So that's, again, something that you would not find in the market rental these days. To have that rent set up at like a lower than market, but also the rent control added on top of that. Again, not to say this is enough. We do acknowledge that this is not going to be the solution for everyone, but in the absence of having the very significant government investments that we used to have, and very competing priorities at the city level to use its limited financial resources, we're using our very limited capital funding, our very limited fees and charges waivers to be able to not only reduce the initial rent, but also be able to cap it at those guidelines so that there's security of tenure for residents.
I'm sorry to miss you earlier, Gus. I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Hi, hello. I'm just curious to know, with all these like affordable housing units popping up and like multiplexes popping up too, like gentrification is a very serious problem with new like development popping in, and of course communities and like these residences are very like prone to be negative about like these type of housing popping up in their neighborhoods. I'm just curious to know, is there any sort of like programs or like anything that eases like residents' minds, or even like any policies that like doesn't force like developers like like just like put like tall buildings like without like talking to the community first?
So I want to highlight a couple of things that the city is doing, and this won't be a complete response, and my colleagues can add to it. The first is that, I think what you're talking about is sort of a NIMBY, or not in my backyard sentiments that we sometimes hear from residents when we're talking about new investments in terms of in communities, whether it be affordable housing or new development. And so part of our approach, we've done a couple things. Most recently in the Jane Finch neighborhood, where we've been planning for growth, we worked closely with our colleagues in social development, finance, and administration to develop what's called a community development plan. And that plan is really to think about all the different investments we can make working with those communities to keep local businesses there, to make sure that existing residents don't feel pushed out of their neighborhoods, and that they're part of that process. And so I think through those community development plans, we've really helped to bring residents along in the process so that they're supporting new growth, they're advocating for new affordable housing, and they still feel like their local neighborhood, whether it be their barbershop that they've used for years, or the grocery store that has affordable groceries, are going to continue to be in place. So that's one piece. The other piece is that, through our consultation processes, we've been very mindful of how do we bring in many voices and larger voices to make sure that we're really hearing all different sentiments in terms of new development. And so I think, COVID was interesting in that we moved most of our general community consultations online, and that actually brought in different voices and different way to hear feedback. We also have tried different interventions in terms of, going out to the local mall to get feedback, or, meeting with students or what have you. So all of that, I think, has been really helpful. There's also a number of different stakeholder groups in the city who are now actively advocating for new affordable housing or new housing supply, and those voices have been really helpful, I think, to build a broader understanding of why we need that supply.
We have a question from a virtual audience, and I'm just going to read it to do justice to it. So it goes like this. We recognize that housing is a human right under international law. We've all played Monopoly, a game that demonstrates that land ownership leads to market domination and resource extortion. AI City Sims have resolved affordability by ending land ownership. How might we, and what are the consequences of ending private land ownership? I'm going to twist that question a little bit and put to our speakers, coming out of that question, whether there might be a space for publicly owned housing. Might there be a future for that in this housing spectrum?
Yeah,
Please.
so maybe I can start that, and that was a heavy question, but I appreciated that anyways. So I think it's actually in recognition of the fact that housing has become financialized to some extent in our city, that housing is no longer a person's home, but sometimes a source of investment, that the city in 2021 brought forward a new program called Multi-Unit Residential Acquisition Program that helps nonprofit housing organizations, co-ops, land trusts, community-based land trusts to purchase properties that could be at risk of being lost in the market. Either they're being sold to a private organization to be demolished and redeveloped, or for whatever other purposes. So we're providing this program, helping the nonprofit sector to purchase properties and turn them into affordable housing for 99 years. So that's a requirement, that you have to operate these as affordable housing for 99 years. That, to me, is one of the solid actions that we have taken to help nonprofits and land trusts and co-ops be a bigger partner in ownership of housing, because their business model is actually operating housing for long term. The other piece that I would add, which is a new piece of work for us that was brought forward as part of our generational transformation report last year, is the city now moving towards a public developer model, meaning that the city and its public agencies like Toronto Community Housing, like CreateTO, and the city as a whole are now taking an intentional role in not only maintaining the ownership of the public land, but also developing housing and maintaining the ownership of housing for 99 years. So we have at least 5 projects that have been brought forward under the public developer model. 11 Brock, there's one in Bellevue, 35 Bellevue, I think is the address, 405 Sherbourne. So there are 5 projects that have been designated as public developer, where the city is taking the land and playing that intentional role in not only maintaining the land, but building and operating housing for long term.
Thank you, Ms. Haley. Thank you for that question from the virtual audience member. I'm going to pull right now as a moderator, and I'm going to hold space and ask my student representative from George Brown College, Daniel Kerr, to ask our speakers one final question before she delivers her thank you remarks. Go ahead, Daniel.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. My question is in relation to mental health. A lot of the issues with homelessness and affordable housing can be attributed to the mental health crisis facing not only Toronto, but Ontario and Canada as a whole. So how will your affordable housing projects kind of account for the mental health crisis that we are facing?
if I could start, I think a lot of our work may start in the shelter system and the outreach work we're doing to people experiencing homelessness, and our continued advocacy to the senior levels of government to consider the issues that propagate or add to the issues we're working towards resolving, and that is having conversations further upfield about what our healthcare system and increase in mental health facilities and beds and other addiction services are made available to people, because right now the need doesn't necessarily match the demand for these spaces is also outweighs the available spaces. When people come into shelter, our efforts are to support them to gaining some stability. We provide mental health care and wraparound supports for people to work on their housing plans, so that when they do seek housing opportunities, their need for supportive housing may not be as great. So that way the spaces that our colleagues in the Housing Secretariat are producing in the supportive housing realm are for those who really are at a higher need, and it just enables us to maybe do more for people across the spectrum of services available.
So just kind of building on that, the city has a target of building or approving 18,000 supportive homes that is mainly dedicated to people experiencing homelessness and other physical health and mental health challenges, as well as seniors who are looking to age in place. Since the beginning of the Housing TO plan, since 2020, we have built over 3,000 supportive housing opportunities in our city. This is either through new construction, where we have built new housing and added wraparound 24/7 support services inside the buildings provided by nonprofit housing sector, or by making available vacant homes in Toronto community housing where people can move into, and then the wraparound support services basically gets added to those units to support the tenants. So there are more efforts, I would say, at the municipal level towards ensuring that our housing comes with those wraparound support services, including mental health support services for those who need it. However, I think there is a point to be made that health and mental health continues to be a responsibility of the provincial government. We rely quite heavily on them to provide funding, not necessarily to the City of Toronto, but to community organizations in our city who are experts in supporting people in their housing and health journeys. So we have been so far successful in securing supportive housing funding for the new supply. However, the need is always greater than what we can provide on our own. So I encourage everyone to kind of join forces and make those calls to the other orders of government to make sure that that funding is in place for people who need it.
Thank you, Ms. Hady. And thank you again, everyone, students, for your questions, whether here in person or virtual. And let's give our presenters a round of applause. Thank you so much, Diana, Sinead, and Mercedes. So once again, I'd like to remind you, this is the end of the presentations, but please stay behind if you'd like to participate in the session with respect to the academic housing strategy, just upstairs by the concourse. If you're unable to stay, or if you're joining us virtually, your input is also welcome online, and I'll ask your instructors to share the website with you. Lastly, our next session will be held on 8th November next week. Not here, though, but in Committee Room 1, and the theme is on arts, culture, and community resilience. Until then, goodbye.